Thank you, Alicia. Hello, all. This is Josh Ostroff with Transportation for Massachusetts. Thank you so much for joining us today for the final webinar of the Performance Measurement Transportation Leadership Academy. I'm pleased to present to you today two speakers, Beth Osborne, Vice President of Transportation at Transportation for America, and Jenna Reeder, who's Director of Performance Management Coordination at the MassDOT Office of Performance Management and Innovation. Today we'll be talking about performance measurement with MassDOT and national perspectives. Before we get into our program, I would just like to thank you who are either listening and watching live or who may be watching the recording of this that will be available in just a few hours for your participation in this academy, and also to acknowledge our funder. The Barr Foundation is a Boston-based private philanthropy who supports both Transportation for America and Transportation for Massachusetts, as well as many other organizations working on areas of transportation, climate change, equity, and other important social trends today. So we've been honored to have your participation. I'm excited to hear what our presenters have to speak about today. Before they get started, I just want to let you know that we will be following up this webinar with first, an email to all participants letting them know where they can view it online, and second, a survey so that we can learn from you about what was successful and what we still need to work on in order to make this this event as productive as possible for all participants. So thank you so much, and we'll be following up next with Beth Osborne, VP of Transportation at Transportation for America. I want to make sure people can hear me okay, though.
Folks on the phone, let us know if they can hear.
The lines are open, so if you're on the phone, if you can just let us know how sound is, that'd be great.
I can hear it fine.
Wonderful.
Great. Okay, good. I was just getting a note from one participant that there was an issue, so I think we're good to go. All right, so with that, I want to ask Beth, please take it away.
Absolutely. Thanks, Josh. This is Beth Osborne with Transportation for America, and my role in today's webinar is just to go over all the things we have covered over the last several months in our various sessions together. The reason for this is A, we covered a ton of information, and B, to remind folks that the resources that we provided are still available. All of the PowerPoint presentations and the contact information of all the folks who participated as resources and experts on various best practices are still available. And we're warned that people would be following back up with them, and we wanted to be sure that you remembered that those resources were there. So throughout the Academy, we were talking about what defined a future-ready transportation system and how regional planning authorities' critical roles could shape local transportation decisions. We wanted to highlight best practices for improving public engagement and mostly for talking to skeptics about what you're trying to achieve. We wanted to identify how performance measures can be applied at different stages of the planning and project development process, review best practices particularly for considering social equity and access to opportunity, which are areas that have always been in discussion but have been elevated to a higher stature, especially access to opportunity, mostly because the technological ability to do so has become so much simpler, and discuss ways to measure greenhouse gas emissions. So going all the way back to Workshop 1, which I believe was last October, we reviewed the basic performance management requirements that were laid out in MAP 21 with a representative from the Federal Highway Administration, and we learned about some best practices from across the country. Those measures include three groupings. Basically, if you look at MAP 21, it's 2 pages long, the whole section on performance management. That has resulted in well over 1,000 pages of regulation. And one thing FHWA realized very quickly was putting it all together in one regulation was going to be overly complicated, make it too difficult and frankly just impenetrable for people to comment and engage. So they broke up the various measures into 3 groupings. One was a group of safety measures, one is system preservation measures, and one is all the rest, traffic congestion, mobile source emissions, freight movement, and general performance. And the first measures had targets that you all know were due last fall. And the second group of measures were just due, I believe, in the last few days. The notion is that every region and every state will set targets within these areas, and then they have to report back on whether or not they met their own self-set targets. One of the things that we talked about in the first meeting was that the measures were not comprehensive. Congress put out the measures on a national basis that they could agree to. They were fully aware of the notion that they were not covering every issue that would be a priority to various regions. So what they ended up doing was leaving those other areas to you to fill in. And I've spoken with many congressional staffers about this, and their basic position was that states and MPOs are fully authorized to add to this list, and if they don't add, then that issue clearly wasn't a priority, that no state or MPO would leave their own priorities off of their to-do list while taking up Congress's. I fear that a lot of states and MPOs didn't realize that was Congress's attitude. And so a lot of what we were trying to do is make sure folks know that Congress has said to you, it's up to you to make sure your priorities are put on par with federal priorities. And the feds will not concern themselves with taking care of that for you. So what's missing is a list of, I just kind of put this together off the top of my head, but it's a long list of other priorities that are increasing in focus for many areas, but just have not reached the level that folks from across the country, Democrat and Republican, can agree to in Congress. In Workshop 2, we dug into more specific areas of performance management. What are some best practices in managing areas outside of the typical engineering measures? So kind of typical engineering measures are pavement condition, bridge condition, and traffic movement. And there's been a lot of advancement in figuring out how to go beyond that and more into outcomes of the transportation system, like economic vitality, access to jobs and other necessities, social equity, and environmental goals. And we talked about that in our second workshop together. On the issue of economic measure, one of the things you may remember me pointing out, and if you want to hear my whole spiel on this, you can go back and look at my original PowerPoint, which goes into more detail on this, and I'm also happy to discuss it with you offline, but we often see that the only economic measure that is brought up by transportation agencies is congestion. And the notion is if you get rid of congestion, you will improve the economy. This is created from the notion that once you've reached a level of heavy congestion, that reducing that congestion is good for the economy, and that is true. But you actually have to reach a very high level of congestion before taking some of it away registers as an economic impact at all. And a lot of places are measuring any increase in speed as both a congestion benefit and an economic good. And you can see from this picture, the one on the left has no congestion. But I hardly think that lack of congestion is a sign of economic vitality and success. The picture on the right has a ton of congestion, but I hardly think it shows an area that is being abandoned. So we need to dig deeper. And it's not to say congestion shouldn't be measured. Congestion mitigation is an excellent priority. It is just not a proxy for economic success. In fact, as the folks at the Texas Transportation Institute often say, the best solution to congestion is a little recession. So if that is the case, then it cannot be an economic measure. And so we wanted to talk about other ways to measure economy. The other thing is the way we measure congestion doesn't quite get at economic benefits of reducing congestion. So, for example, if you compare Atlanta to Chicago, Atlanta is seen as having less congestion than Chicago because Atlanta has a less of a difference between its rush hour speeds and its off-peak speeds. But even its off-peak speeds, or its off-peak travel times, are longer than Chicago's peak travel times. So we're missing something in the way we measure congestion. And if you go through our original discussion on this, it talks about many examples of ways to measure congestion that's a little more on point than the way we typically do it. So some other ways of measuring the impact of transportation on the economy would include things like attracting development, increasing property values, creating jobs, connecting people to jobs, reducing travel costs, improving freight access, and reducing energy use. One of the problems with a lot of this is they are impacted by things other than transportation. It can be often very challenging to isolate transportation's impact on these areas. So we dug a little bit deeper into particularly access to work and other destinations that are important. One of the things that we did here, you'll probably remember, actually Alicia, jump 2 slides for me. You might remember that we looked at some maps that mapped out how many jobs were accessible, and we had a rolling level of accessibility. Jobs that were within 15 minutes got more weight than jobs that were 30 minutes away, that got more weight than jobs that were 45 minutes away. We could parse this looking at drive times, transit times, bike-ped times, and you can wrap all of it together. And this was an example of a map showing the job accessibility in the AM peak by transit in Madison, Wisconsin. And you can see that basically the closer you are into town, the better your transit accessibility. The further out you get, the harder it gets to reach jobs. And then you could overlay where areas of poverty exist. And what you see is as we are suburbanizing poverty, they are particularly disconnected from jobs by our transit system, which is designed really to serve those urban areas. Underlying a lot of this work, and Alicia, if you go back one, is some interesting research that's been done in a handful of places looking at people's tolerance for travel by different modes. So we don't assume that a job that takes 15 minutes to get to by car is weighted the same way or with the same value as a job that's 15 minutes by other modes. And interestingly, from this you can tell that the people value work trips in a different way from non-work trips. So one of the examples I tend to think of is if I am going to the grocery store, I am not comfortable with a grocery store trip that takes me 30 minutes by car, especially in town. But I probably am comfortable with a 30-minute trip to work. And that's because we have different expectations for trips to work versus other events. We kind of organize our day around the commute trip, and all those other things have to fit into our off-work time and therefore have to be more convenient. What's interesting is if you look at walk, you probably remember this from the presentations because I made a pretty big deal about it, people have a lower tolerance for work trips while walking than non-work trips. Leisure trips, restaurants, and even retail and things like that, people are willing to take a pretty decent stroll to non-work trips as opposed to work trips. And so it's the exact split for those. And so there's just some interesting travel information buried in the assumptions in some of the access to jobs and other necessities, mapping and measurement that's being done. If you go back to slide 12, and I can get people much more information on this, all of this is derived from a GIS add-on called Sugar Access that just takes your transit feeds and congestion information and trip times and feeds it into a model that looks at the value of things based on how long it takes to get there. And this is more than any other measure what I find that people mean by supporting the economy through transportation investments. They don't tend to mean jobs, particularly construction jobs, because we could pay people to dig ditches and fill them back in. They really mean access to permanent employment. And employers look at it the same way. Are you connecting me with the customers? Are you connecting me with my employees and talent? So we spent a good amount of time talking about that, but there's much more to be said there. We also heard from the Met Council, who has spent the last several years really focusing on ways to increase their priority in investing in areas of concentrated poverty. And so they talked about the way they put some extra points to projects that are serving areas of concentrated poverty. And the big message I got from them is a mistake that folks make is putting emphasis on projects that touch areas of concentrated poverty. But you can have a project go through a poor area that actually does damage to the poor area. So just being present there is not enough. It has to be or addressing a problem that that community is trying to solve. Maybe it's connecting them to other areas where there are services or jobs they need to reach. It is ameliorating damage done by a project in the past or a danger that has been created by the transportation system. And the Met Council is really focused on connecting those geographic areas to particular solutions. Some of the lessons that they reminded us of, if you can go to the next slide, is that equity is a fine discussion that people don't take very seriously until real money is involved. And when you're actually determining where money is going to go, then they get very interested in what you're doing. They also found that equitable development crosses institutional boundaries. And I think this is probably a conversation folks remember. Advancing equity was heard as a code for funding transit and funding the core of the region. And therefore, the suburban counties originally rejected what they were trying to do. One of the things they tried to do was add age, so seniors as an equity definition. They held that back because seniors often have significantly more money than non-seniors, at least in their region. So they really wanted to focus on those who didn't have access to reliable transportation. And what was interesting is, in spite of the fact that that's what people feared, that turned out to be a wrong assumption. That actually suburban and exurban communities did very, very well on the equity measures, because as we have suburbanized poverty, those are the folks that are most disconnected from the needs that they need to get to on a daily basis. So this was initially seen as a way to steer money into urban core, and it just turned out to be a bad assumption. And each year they are refining that process. We also heard from someone talking about GHG emissions from the transportation sector. And one thing I will point out is on the graph on the right, you see that nationally it shows the utility sector as the #1 GHG emitter, with transportation just below. But this goes to 2015, and if you go out to 2016, those lines crossed nationally, and transportation became the top emitter nationwide. You can see on the left that transportation was already the top emitter by sector in Massachusetts. And what's underlying that push, if we move on to the next slide, is that vehicle miles traveled is going up. It has been going up steadily. Now, this only goes to 2016, but there's been some really interesting things happening on the VMT front. We could have a whole webinar on that alone. We have seen some personal VMT go down, but a lot of personal VMT is going down because we are deferring trips and having things delivered to our homes instead. And so freight VMT is way up. So some of the things going on that may even be allowing people to travel less may not be resulting yet in less travel. It just may be less person travel, more freight travel. So I might not go to the store to pick up clothes for my kids, but I order it from Amazon, so a trip is still made, for example. Another thing we discovered in this, that a lot of the VMT growth, particularly in the state of Massachusetts, is driven by the style of development. low residential density requires people to drive. When you spread everything out, there is simply no way to get around outside of a car, and every trip is longer. So not only are you driving more, every trip takes longer and requires more miles driven. And in more high-density development, you just have more destinations close to you. So it makes it possible to trip chain or drive to a town center and do a whole bunch of errands all in one place. And your trips tend to be shorter and fewer. So the way we're developing our communities is leading to a situation where people have no choice but to drive more and emit more. And so getting land use and transportation together is really important. Moving on to workshop 3, we dug deeply into the way Virginia has been measuring the benefits of their various investments and in order to prioritize investments. Going on to the next slide, that included the thing that, there's a whole presentation on this that we could go through again. The thing that I think is most important here is that they create a benefit score and then compare the benefit score, a numeric score, to the cost. It is not a traditional benefit cost analysis, because a traditional benefit cost analysis compares the benefits that we know how to monetize to the cost. But what they've done in Virginia is said, we don't need to monetize every benefit. We need to give value to the things we care about in a way that makes sense and compare that number score to the cost. And that way, we are not just selecting projects based on how much benefit they have, which often is associated with how much money you're spending. So the more you spend, the more benefits you have. We don't want to just choose projects because they're expensive. We want to choose projects based on how much they maximize those benefits for your investment. So projects that get more benefit for less cost jump to the top. In workshop 4, we started talking about how performance measures could be applied at different stages of the process, how to identify performance measures that fit different agencies' sizes and capabilities. We started looking particularly at more rural areas and thought about more individual goals. And so we talked particularly about rural transit needs, which are different than urban transit needs. Moving to the next slide, I think one of the things that we really focused on is in rural areas, particularly seniors are not only in need of transit, but they are in need of demand response type transportation, which can be befuddling because it is very expensive. And that they don't need just transportation for jobs or medical purposes, but also for basic shopping. And in a lot of cases, rural areas don't have access to the delivery service that many of us in more urban areas have. So they're heavily reliant on someone who can give them a ride or a demand response type of transportation system, even where there is more fixed guideway systems or fixed route systems. Sometimes there's added help that seniors need in getting around. We also talked about something that Houston took on, which was a major redesign of their bus system. Their bus system had grown up over decades, but in the time period that they had built out their bus system, the overall geography of Houston and where people lived had changed by a great deal. And they were creating a bus system that was more and more spread out, but it wasn't necessarily conforming to the changing way that people moved around the region and where they were living and needing to go. So they discovered that reasons people weren't riding the bus. Number one is the reason we hear the most often, that bus headways are infrequent. You all may recall that I'm from New Orleans, and I remember very well trying to get the bus from my parents' house in a first-ring suburb down to the French Quarter where I worked at a restaurant. And I got to the bus stop and waited for an hour and 15 minutes for the bus before I gave up and went back home. And it turned out that I needed to wait 15 more minutes for the bus because there are 90-minute headways. Well, it doesn't matter how good that route is, how many people it serves. It doesn't matter how direct it is to where I need to go. The fact of the matter is 90-minute headways is garbage, and no one uses that. So Houston realized that the bus headways were a big problem, that the bus routes were very confusing and indirect. In fact, much of the transit system we have, FTA gives credit and transit agencies try to show they're serving more people, which create more circuitous and confusing routes, which are less useful. They found many routes were very much organized around the workday, and so they didn't run on the weekend, but people needed the bus on the weekend, and it just didn't go where they wanted to go. So they showed us how their map, going on to the next slide, this was the map. The red were their real trunk lines with 10 to 15-minute headways. That 10 to 15 minutes is about the max of what people will handle unless they don't have other choices. And you can see by the next map how much they expanded the number of routes that had frequent transit service. And by doing this, they saw an increase in weekday ridership, but they also saw an increase in weekend ridership by a much larger amount, just based on things like rationalizing the headways and just making sure people understood where those buses went a little bit easier. One thing I like to point out to folks is people love buses because they're flexible. When I say people, I mean governments love buses because they're flexible, and what governments mean by that is they are flexible for the government to provide cheap service. From the user perspective, that flexibility is confusing and scary, and none of the flexibility is usually being used to the benefit of the user, and so recognizing that is really important to providing good bus service. Moving on to our last workshop, we talked about how the RPAs could promote a future-ready transportation system, and how you can interact with these various tools and federal and state agencies to create really strong transportation decisions, and we started working on action plans. We also had a couple webinars. They're also taped if you want to go back and look at them. The Nashville story was an excellent story about how to incorporate health into the conversation about transportation and how to weight projects based on how they support public health in your decision-making process. Also, Nashville is a great story on equity because their health measures were really a proxy for supporting lower-income communities where they found that the health outcomes were the worst. So that was a health inequity twofer. And Webinar 2, we talked about how to engage the public in discussions of transportation generally, but also how to talk about performance measures. We talked about transportation standing generally, and I hope you all remember Steve's presentation about just you need to talk about what you're trying to do with transportation, but you generally are never going to use the word performance measures when talking to normal people. It's only weirdos like all of us on the phone that talk about that sort of thing. So that brings me to the end, and I can hand things off to Jenna.
Great. Thanks, Beth. So can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. So yeah, this is Jenna Reeder. I work for MassDOT in the Office of Performance Management and Innovation, and I'm the Director of Performance Management Coordination. And I'm excited to be here today with all of you. And I think what you'll see is when I go, some of the things I'm going to talk through, I think you'll see things that Beth just referenced in going through a lot of the sort of overview. It sounds like you've really touched on a lot of exciting topics, and now I want to go back and listen to some of those webinars that you talked about, Beth, because they sound really interesting, some case studies and things. But basically what I plan to do today is just quickly talk a little bit about what our office does, where we came from, and what we're supposed to do, and then talk a little generally about how we think about and use performance management at MassDOT, how we've been working on those MAP 21 measures that Beth outlined at the beginning, and a little bit more about sort of what we see for us on the horizon as we're sort of always engaged in that process of trying to perform better in our performance management program, if you will. Okay, next slide. So the Office of Performance Management and Innovation, we were established in 2009 when MassDOT was reformed. So I don't know how many of you out in the audience know your MassDOT history, but MassDOT didn't exist until 2009. Before that, where there was the Executive Office of Transportation, there was Mass Highway, a bunch of different transportation organizations that serve different purposes around the state. So as part of the legislation that created this DOT for the state, there was also a clause in there that said that this new organization had to have an Office of Performance Management and Innovation. And specified in that legislation was that we have to provide an annual report every year to the legislature that outlines the performance of the whole organization for the state. And then in 2013, there was another piece of legislation that was passed that went further into some transportation requirements, and it sort of reaffirmed our role, and it actually got more specific about some of the things that we were supposed to measure, and it even spells out some specific targets that we are supposed to be tracking towards. So that took a few years of sort of trying to figure out what that is and what that looks like. And then when our new governor, Governor Baker, not new anymore, but at the time, when he came into office and established Secretary Pollack, or now Secretary of Transportation, and there was a little bit of shakeup and rethinking of things, there was an idea to merge with a similar office that existed before at the MBTA. So MassDOT includes the MBTA, or transit system. And so there was sort of a similar sister office at the MBTA, and there was this idea that, well, if we could join forces here and merge our skills across these two businesses, we could make a stronger team and sort of do a better job of coordinating and working together. And so that's what we did in 2016. And so at this point, our office has 15 full-time employees, but that's a little bit misleading because we actually have at any given time about 15 interns as well, who are amazing, that we get from various universities and co-op students and stuff. And so we're really more a team of 30 that work on all sorts of different projects around the agency. And I'll talk a little bit more about some specifics. So next slide, yeah. So kind of the big topics that we work on, we don't really think of it this way, but for the sake of this presentation, we sort of have our performance management topics and activities, and we have our sort of more innovation projects. And so the performance management, the stuff that I do really, and that is really specified in the legislation, is this sort of partnering with our operating divisions and helping them with just determining how to measure what they do, what their goals and targets should be, informed by investment and projects in the pipeline and stuff like that. So that's kind of the highest level thing. But then we also partner with divisions on sort of ad hoc projects where we look at whether they come to us and say, oh, we would really like a monthly report on our operations for the MBTA. And so we work with them on what is it that you want to know, how is this best measured, what's the best way to visualize this, and then the best way to sort of produce that report. So we do that for some of our divisions as well. We also work with different divisions within the DOT on sort of process improvement projects and re-engineering. So it can be something in our HR department where they come to us and they say, for instance, we want to improve our onboarding process. We think that can be a better process for our new employees, and so we go through a process improvement project with them where we sort of map out what they're doing and we work with them to figure out how they can improve that. And then we also do produce I mentioned the monthly reports, but we also have a few dashboard style reports or online dashboards that are things that are updated automatically daily. The one that's public right now is the MBTA Back on Track dashboard, and that was something that we designed after the winter of 2015. So for those of you who were in Massachusetts then, we may remember the crazy winter and all those storms and how the transit system really ground to a halt. And so as a response to that, we worked with the T, and we designed this dashboard that is sort of our public accountability and transparency about the performance of the MBTA system. So that's something that our office does. On the innovation side, that's a word that can mean a lot of different things. I think the areas we've really focused on are related to open data and data sharing, and we partner with different vendors and stakeholders throughout the state. We work very closely with the Commonwealth IT group, and my boss serves as a sort of person on the open data policy program for the whole Commonwealth, because that's something that as we have more and more data, but people are concerned about privacy issues and that sort of thing. That's sort of an ongoing issue, but we sort of try to stay ahead of it. We've definitely taken the stance that data is there to be shared with the public, and so that's an example of what MassDOT's done in that area as sort of a leader in the area is back when this is maybe back to 2012 or so, but 2013, there was a decision made to deploy our own Bluetooth sensors on our roadways to run what is now our go time system. So when you're driving down the highway and you see the variable message signs that tell you it's going to take 15 minutes to get to whatever your next exit, there were two ways to go about that. One was to purchase data from a data vendor and use that in our signs, and another was to collect our own data. And at the time, the decision was that it was actually at the time more cost effective. That's probably not the case anymore, but to deploy our own system, and that we would also then have ownership of that data, and so we'd have the flexibility to use that data for research purposes. And so it is a thing that we are able to share with research entities and such. I just used it the other day in a project that we were doing where we wanted to look for get some information about travel speeds on a roadway. So it has helped us. So that's just sort of an area of our innovation. We also help a lot with testing out pilot projects, and those can take many forms, from things on NVTA to looking at, for instance, we're just working on a survey looking at the RIDE, the MBTA's paratransit system, which has piloted an Uber-Lyft partnership program. So that gets to that issue Beth was talking about with transit in rural areas for people that need paratransit services. It really helps that. But we're working with them on a survey to help identify kind of the ways to move forward with that pilot, because it has been successful, but what's the best way to tweak it. So that's just kind of the landscape of the types of things that our office does. We touch a lot of different areas, but we really see this all as part of performance management, as we're sort of digging into certain little nooks and crannies of the organization, pulling out data, and then figuring out how to turn it into information that helps our leaders make decisions. So next slide. This is just sort of that basic performance management cycle that I'm sure you've seen in different webinars, but we try to hold true to this at MassDOT as well, where we think about performance management fitting into all these different phases. It helps, with your planning as you look at your trends and see where you're going and try to set your targets. And then you funnel that into the way that you make your decisions. And then, of course, once your decisions are turned into projects on the ground, we try to keep our handle on whether or not those investments are turning into outcomes that we predicted. And then funneling that back in, feeding that back into that planning process. So that's the goal. I can admit that it doesn't always work as well. There's definitely that tendency to use it to make the decisions and then forget to look backwards. And I think I know we can do better at that. I know that's a theme I hear from the folks at DOTs all around the country. So we're not alone, but we're trying to do better. Okay, next slide. So this is just a slide, a shot of our most recent annual performance reports. I mentioned that this is part of ITER legislation. This is I manage this project every year, and this is kind of the bread and butter of our office. So while we do a million other things, everyone knows that if we don't do tracker, we won't really be doing our jobs. And so we put this together every year. The state legislation requires that it come out by the end of a calendar year. but we track it on a state fiscal year basis. So what we try to do is publish it as close as we can to the end of the state fiscal year, which is the end of June. But usually that actually, it lags a little bit into the fall. Usually last year we've gotten it out in November. And part of that is because there are some measures that we have to wait for the federal fiscal year to close. And so it always seems a little silly to publish something in September if there's going to be new data that comes out in October. And so that's kind of how the timeline works there. Thank you. This is how we organize Tracker. So we within our performance reports, each division has its own section. And actually, you can go to the next slide, and then I'll come back to this one. I should have put them. So we have 5 operating divisions at MassDOT: Highway, Aeronautics, the Registry of Motor Vehicles, Rail and Transit, and the MBTA. And so each section in Tracker is organized into these 5 operating divisions. But then, back one slide, please. Within each of those divisions, we break the performance measures into these performance goal areas. And the Secretary Pollack established these when she came into her position, and we just kind of set the stage for what we're trying to do and kind of keep us focused. And I think it's helpful to organize the measures into these different categories because it helps you, especially across divisions, kind of see how, whether you're working at the Registry of Motor Vehicles or you're working in the Division of Aeronautics, we're still all focused on things such as customer experience and safety in all of these different areas. So we can go ahead now, I guess 2 slides. So the measures that we have in Tracker, and I like what Beth said about the intent of MAP 21 was that, here are basic measures that we were given, but that agencies should really go above and beyond based on what was important to them. And so at MassDOT with Tracker, what we have tried to do as the MAP 21 measures have come online is incorporate those into Tracker, but also retain Tracker as our annual performance report that really reflects what MassDOT wants to do and is important to us. And we've had to do that anyway because we have these performance measures that are in the legislation. So basically, where we have measures that come from the legislation because that's what states we have to include. We also work closely with the administrators of our, highway administrator and the aeronautics administrator and all of the leaders of the divisions to talk to them about what's important. And sometimes there are issues or a program that they'd like to highlight for a few years, and so therefore we pull in measures, and then at some point they may sunset. So for instance, we have in the past included measures on Easy Pass usage on our highways because that was something that was important to sort of see how we were doing in getting people to use transponders because that was helping our system. And then, of course, we moved over to all electronic tolling last year, and so now we're still tracking that because it still shows, everyone who has a transponder it's a reduced cost to us because we don't have the administrative paperwork and costs of mailing people their bills. But at some point, we're probably going to hit a saturation point. And so I think we may sunset that measure after a couple of years. And so we just allow that flexibility. Other years, it's been the Complete Streets program, which is a program that many of you may know about rolling out into municipalities. But that's a program that was an exciting program. It really tries to get to some of our goals. And so what the measures we have for that are sort of tracking it through its process. And so those aren't measures that will necessarily stay relevant for years to come, but we find them important for now. And then the federal legislation, MAP 21. So we really are including those in Tracker, and because we also, while we want to be flexible, we also want to be consistent in the way that we're reporting these things. So we've actually changed the way we've reported some of our performance measures to align them with those MAP 21 measures. For instance, the bridge performance measures we used to. We've added the MAP 21 measure. We've been measuring bridges in a number of ways over the years, but we've included the one that MAP 21 asks for as well because that's the deck area one, and that's just a slightly different one than we've been using before. Okay, next slide. So the other thing that Tracker does that we is it sort of serves as our the foundational performance management document, I guess, for the agency. And so I work really closely with all sorts of folks throughout the agency as they're putting together a lot of these plans. And I sit on the different planning teams to review performance measures. We're doing that right now with our pedestrian plan, which will be coming out for public review within the next month, probably sooner. And so, for instance, the team that was putting together that pedestrian transportation plan came to me and said, can you help me work on these performance measures? And so we worked closely on that to make sure that, some of them, any of that we already have in Tracker, we would want to incorporate into that plan. But then in some cases it makes sense for there to be additional performance measures within that plan that wouldn't necessarily be sort of appropriate for Tracker, but they still remain consistent. And then also being involved in these plans that helps, I can then help support with additional resources, other performance measures or data collection efforts that we might want to do. Focus 40 is another example. That's our long-range transportation plan for the MBTA. And so we're working closely with that team on those performance measures. So it's just sort of a way to make sure that all of these different efforts are talking to each other. We also work with the team looking at the CIP, the Capital Investment Plan, each year. And to the extent that we've been able to, there's not always a clear connection, but every year we try to improve a bit on our linkage between those annual performance measures and Tracker and the way that we're looking at the programs that we have laid out in the CIP. Okay, next slide. So 2 years ago in 2016, the MAP 21 legislation had come out and had explained how the target setting horizons would work. And so at the time, we thought this seemed like a smart way of doing our target setting horizons. And so we basically adopted it into Tracker, which has been really helpful because this year we're now going through a target setting process, and it's lining up perfectly with what we have to report to FHWA for MAP 21. So that's been really nice. So basically what we did was in 2016, we sat down with all the different divisions. We looked at the performance measures we were including, and we asked them to set targets for 2 years and 4 years out. So that was 2018 and 2020. And that's sort of the framework that's required for MAP 21. We also felt it was important to include a long-term target because that sort of allows each of the divisions to think about a little bit where we're going in the future. And so we have that in Tracker as well. And then we held those targets for 2017. We sort of looked at how we were tracking against them, but then in 2018 we've sort of come back. Now we're at a target setting year, and so we're looking at how we've done with respect to those 2018 targets. We're revisiting the 2020 targets we've set that were the 4-year targets, now the 2-year targets. There's an opportunity to revisit those. And then we're setting new targets for 2022, and we're revisiting the ones for those long-term targets. So that's kind of the cycle that we've got on. And it's actually worked really well. People seem to really understand that it makes sense. It means we're not setting targets every year, which would be really burdensome. And it's really nice that it lines up for federal highway. It does mean that the folks that are registering motor vehicles have to do what federal highway asks in terms of this timeline, and doesn't necessarily that's not something that they would normally have to do since they don't fall under MAP 21 performance measures, but they seem to see the value in it as well. So that's been a good process that we've adopted. Next slide. And I see that we're getting close to the end, so I'll try to speed through these last two slides. But basically, this is just a snapshot of what one of the pages from Tracker. The best way to find our annual performance report, if you've never found it or seen it, is just to Google MassDOT Tracker, and it should come right up. The 2017 report should come right up. But basically, each of our divisions, we have one of these scorecards, and this is just showing kind of the measures. They are organized by these goal areas on the left column. We have the measures. We track, we display our current ones, and then we have these columns that show, how we've done the last year, and then we put forth those targets associated with each measure. Next slide. And then for each measure, we follow up with more detail about the graphs that show. And so this is all, this is kind of a layout for what Tracker is. We also have a good amount of text in our report because we feel it's important to provide context for these performance measures because, of course, so much of it is more than just what is shown in these numbers. Things that are hard to just, need context for interpretation. Okay, next slide. So this is my attempt to kind of map out the way that we're working with the MPOs and the RTAs to establish our MAP 21 coordination. So I'm just trying to show the relationship here. Basically, that we as a state are working on these three areas of the PM1, PM2, PM3, these areas of performance measurement, and then we work with the MBTA closely on their transit asset management because they also have things they have to put forth for MAP 21. And then, of course, the MPOs are adopting performance measures on their own based on the ones that were set or in response to the ones we've set, but they have the ability to go off and set their own targets as well. But all of these things are sort of cycling back and feeding Tracker, and then the RTAs are working both with us, the state, and the MPOs, and then we also we will pull in the things that the RTAs are establishing for their MAP 21, and we'll include those in Tracker as well. So just an attempt to illustrate sort of the connection that we're trying to make between all these different entities and the regulations and reporting. Okay, next slide. So I just want to talk a little bit about where we hope to go and what the things that we're excited about working on. So the first one is the CIP. I mentioned a little bit about how we work with that, but we have a tool that's called Planning for Performance, which is sort of a forecasting tool that allows us to look at our different programs in the CIP, and it attaches performance measures for that. And that's the thing I was mentioning. Every year we try to do a little better and get a little more nuance with our measurement and our forecasting of what it looks like based on different funding amounts that we may be putting into those program buckets. Another area is looking at some roadway data, whether we're exploring opportunities to purchase better roadway data that will give us a better picture, but also use some of the data that we already have to look at things like congestion, reliability, all those types of measures that Beth was talking about in her point of the presentation, to inform all sorts of things, everything from determining, like, comparing interchange projects to understanding more nuances about our travel behavior, and again, feeding back into that process. I mentioned earlier, sometimes it seems like we fall short on really circling back to understand whether the investments that we made kind of held to the outcomes that we were hoping to see, and so that's something that we're talking about and hoping to do better in the future. And then another big thing for us that we're launching into is looking at how to create what elements of Tracker would serve an audience if they were available in a more interactive and more frequent format. So right now we have a document we produce every year that sits as a PDF on a website, but what we're doing is looking into sort of interactive formats for that, and whether some measures are appropriate to be updated on a more than an annual basis, and what that might look like, and kind of what's the best package to present to our audience for Tracker, so that people can stay informed in a way, and just to leverage that data that we have, because we do have all these tools available to us. So those are also sort of things that are on our horizon as we look forward to improving our performance management. And I think that was my last slide. So I'm happy to take questions. My email address is also on the slide. Feel free to follow up with me at any time. I'm happy to have further offline conversations as well.
Thank you, Jenna. This is Alicia. Hi, everybody. We do have a few questions. I'm going to open up the lines first to see if there are any questions. You are able to talk. So let me know if you have any questions, people that are that have dialed in. Okay, seems like there's none. So I'm going to go ahead and I want to be respectful of everyone's time. So I'm going to ask. They were all very similar questions, and if I don't answer your questions, I'll get them to Jenna and Beth and get you an answer via email. The question is, does OPMI ever provide support to RTAs? And how does MassDOT performance measure help local regional planners? And Jenna, that's a question for you.
Oh, sorry, I was on mute. Yeah, so great question. So we work really closely with the Rail and Transit Division at MassDOT to support the RTAs. So basically, that's how we've engaged with RTAs so far, is sort of through our Rail and Transit Division. It doesn't mean that we couldn't support RTAs directly. So if you have an idea about how we could help you, we would be really interested in hearing from you, because we know that the RTAs, there's a lot. It's a lot of data, and I know the RTAs in Massachusetts, many of them are don't have a lot of resources to do what needs to be done. And then in the question of how these help the local agencies, I think that I take a very high level. My job, my role is to sort of take a very high level view, but we are working with directly with the MPOs on their performance. We have a performance management subcommittee with the MPO group, and we hope that the things that we're measuring are directly impacting kind of the projects that get state funding and that sort of thing. But I again will say that we're open to ideas for how the state can better support local agencies with respect to these performance measure areas. So please get in touch with me if you have ideas, because it'd be really interested to hear how we can do a better job in that area.
This is Josh. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
Oh, great. Okay, so I think that as one of the organizations that helped put this program together, MARPA, the State Association of Regional Planning Agencies, could be a really good resource, because I know that we are still actually in the relatively early days, as I think Jenna implied, of implementing performance measurement at the state level. I mean, notwithstanding all the great stuff that's been done, it's a very complex and fast-moving field. And so I think we will, as one of the follow-ups from this, try to coordinate ways that we can provide a conduit so that working through RPAs, there could perhaps be some future capability that some of the learning at MassDOT on performance measurement could flow from the RPAs to local government, so that there, as you say, a project that is very important to to a locality, that they have some tools or resources to score it, assess it, see how similar investments have paid off to get in line for better funding, and we hope greater public confidence in the merits of the public investment. So that's sort of a one takeaway for how we might implement some of the learning here in the future.
Thanks, Josh.
All right. Well, I think that covers the questions. And if folks go home and think about something they heard today and realize they had a question they didn't get a chance to ask, you should send it in to us, and we'll direct it to the right person and get you an answer. But it's really been great learning about what you all are trying to do in your various regions and the challenges you face. I hope that the information we've been able to provide you over the last year has been helpful to you. Expectations for what transportation agencies and regional planners are expected to accomplish go up as resources stay pretty steady, if not go down. And so we're going to have to be really clear about what we are getting and where there are trade-offs and exactly what those trade-offs look like in order to get good reviews from our public. And so hopefully we have found ways to help you to do that. And again, if things come up and as you're trying to progress and do more, there's something you're looking for, we hope you look to us to help you to do that. We really love working with leaders in the field that want to produce a better product for their constituents. So with that, I think we will end.
Thank you so much, Beth. And I want to put in a plug for people to reach out to Transportation for America. They've got great resources for members. And as a reminder, this content, this webinar and all the other presentations that we've done are online at t4ma.org/academy. So feel free to share that within your organizations. And you'll be hearing from me soon with a follow-up survey, so we can assess our own performance.
All right.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks all.